Hey, welcome in. I'm Mike Pilch, Pilch's Perspective. Another history lesson for you today, and it is in the world of sports, but it's a little bit different, not necessarily a player or anything. This time we're going to kind of the other side of sports that certainly gets more attention now, but sports trainers and the medical side, if you want to call it that. And we're going to start with really one of the first true sports trainers or physicians that we are aware of. And he really comes from more or less my backyard. His name was John Reese, and history knows him better as Bonesetter Reese. He was born in the 1850s in Wales. Now, his father died when he was an infant, and his mother died when he was just 11. And the day after her funeral, he had to go to work in the iron mills in Welsh. Life was tough, and the work in those iron mills was absolutely brutal. He was a child mule driver, and he befriended an old man who went by the name of Tom Jones, who was known to be able to repair the large number of adults and kids that were badly injured in the mill due to the falling beams and just the crude machinery of the time. And the man taught Bonesetter how to manipulate the limbs, the muscles, the joints, even some of the bones. So he's learning this from a very early age. Now, in the 1880s, Reese would immigrate to Youngstown, Ohio, which is, don't live in Youngstown, but it's 15 minutes, 20 minutes down the road. So it's really my backyard. And that's because there were no jobs in Wales at the time. There was nothing there. So there was a large immigration. And of course, in that era, 1880s to the early 1900s, there's a lot of immigration to the United States. He was one of them. He began working in the Youngstown mills, which were a big deal here until the mid to late 70s. Now, according to a Reese family historian, he started by treating an injured mill worker in 1889. That mill worker had suffered a separated shoulder, a dislocated shoulder, actually. And this man in his 20s came up and miraculously made him better. And so Reese continued working in the steel mills, but he would treat people, and he became known for this. And whenever somebody got hurt, which was frequently, he would suddenly treat them and get them better. The problem is this was taking away from his main source of income because he only got paid as a mill worker and a steel worker. And if he wasn't doing his job, he didn't get paid, even though he helped his employer by getting these injured men and boys back to work sooner. So Reese decided in 1894 to go into the medical practice full time. Now, it's a crime in Ohio for a non-doctor to charge for medical work. So because of this, the Bonesetter never actually charged his patients for any of the work he did. He'd simply say, pay what you can. And so mill workers and the poor really didn't pay much at all, and he never had a problem with that. He actually loved helping the poor and mill workers because that was the background he came from. And as he started doing more and more of this, word of mouth spread. His magical healing abilities became known, basically. And eventually there were a number of newspaper articles talking about his abilities and got to the point where he kind of became a worldwide celebrity. There were very wealthy individuals that would actually come and see him in Youngstown at his home from around the globe, and some of them would pay thousands of dollars per session. Now, eventually, Reese did become, like I said, world famous, but medical doctors didn't like it. They had worked hard for their degree and to get their medical license, and they didn't like they thought he was kind of a quack and not a real doctor and all this, so they tried shutting him down. But the Ohio Medical Board then gave him a special license to practice medicine as long as he didn't perform any cutting operations. Another article at the time said the Bonesetter actually tried attending medical school at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland in, I think, 1897, but he actually quit the first week because he fainted when he first saw blood. So he's good working with the body and the muscles and the joints, but he didn't like a lot of the other stuff. Now, according to Reese's biography, the first baseball player he treated, and this is significant because he is in some ways is considered baseball and in some ways sports first great miraculous trainer. First player was a baseball player from Youngstown named Jimmy McAleer, who was an outfielder for the Cleveland Spiders. I know a lot of people wanted the Indians to become the Spiders. Instead, they're the Guardians. Different story for a different time. He became manager later of the St. Louis Browns, who are now the Baltimore Orioles. And word about Reese's talents hit the big leagues and hit the pro sports realm. And in 1903, Bonesetter was actually offered the position of full-time team physician by the Pittsburgh Pirates, who would lose the first ever Modern World Series that year. But the Bonesetter refused the offer. He decided to treat players no matter who they played for. Stipulation being they had to come see him. They went to his home in Youngstown to do that. Now, Reese's biographer, David Strickler, listed 54 players that the Bonesetter treated. This is from really the 1900s, 10s, 20s, and very, very early 30s. 28 of those 54 are in the Baseball Hall of Fame. Many more visited Bonesetter Reese, but weren't listed because Reese didn't really care for the publicity. He didn't kind of like people knowing what he did. He didn't care about it. And some players just didn't want anybody to know that they were hurt. And his home is still standing. It's on Park Avenue in downtown Youngstown. It's not very far from Youngstown State University, only a couple blocks away. To give you an idea who he helped treat, there were a number of big leaguers. I mentioned the 28 Hall of Famers. There were also celebrities and politicians that would come see him as well. That included President Theodore Roosevelt, Charles Evans Hughes, and former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George actually came to Youngstown in the United States to be worked on by Bonesetter Reese. World heavyweight champion Gene Tunney, of course, of the Tunney long count in 1927, saw him, as well as Will Rogers, who may have been the biggest celebrity of his day. That's arguable, but he was up there. Billy Sunday was the famous evangelist. He had been a Major League Baseball player at the turn of the century before becoming an evangelist. He came to see him on numerous occasions while as a player and afterwards. And then countless showgirls and ballerinas and stuff like that would come see him because of the strained muscles and the twisted ankles and all that. He got you better. There were a lot of pitchers with arm ailments and elbow ailments and shoulder ailments that would come see him and struggling throwing the ball, and he'd work on them for a bit, and they were better. They didn't have the same pain in the arm. Their velocity would return. The snap on their breaking stuff would return. Nobody really knows what he did, but there's a lot of stories of it not being gentle. A lot of stories of well-known athletes of the time screaming in pain for moments and then being fine afterwards. And they said, it's totally worth it because I feel great afterwards. This included Honus Wagner. Wagner, absolutely one of the greatest players of all time, especially when you look at what he was compared to the rest of his era, and was a big, powerfully built man. He said, Reese hurt him like the devil, but he always does the work. And Reese himself liked Honus a lot, saying, since he had this reputation and they called him Bonesetter, Honus was actually, according to Bonesetter Reese, trembling down to his shoes. And he said he fainted dead away once he actually touched him. Don't know if that's true or not, but that is the story. To give you an idea, some of the Hall of Famers and All-Stars he treated: Cy Young, Christy Mathewson, Walter Johnson, Big Ed Walsh, the spitball king of the 1900s, one of the stars of the 1906 World Series; Grover Cleveland Alexander, 80 Joss, who's the all-time leader in ERA; Chief Bender and Stan Kovaleski, who was Cleveland's hero in the 1920 World Series; catchers Gabby Hartnett and Roger Bresnahan; first baseman George Sisler and Frank Chance; second baseman Eddie Collins, Rogers Hornsby, and Napoleon Lajoie; third baseman Home Run Baker and Jimmy Collins; shortstops Wagner and Donnie Bush, who later became a manager; outfielders Ty Cobb, Shoeless Joe Jackson, Trish Speaker, Ed Roush, and Max Carey; and yes, manager John McGraw saw the Bonesetter as well. So I'm still standing on Park Avenue in Youngstown. Again, it's not very far at all from Youngstown State University, and some of the historians of the area know about it, but he was extremely well known and got some of the biggest names in the world to come to Youngstown and have them look at him. And I think it's funny because, some of my grandparents, aunts, and uncles would have been around near Youngstown at that time. And he would have been doing his work in that era. He later died in 1931. He was in his 70s. And when he died, his name, or I should say his death, actually made big news. There was a huge obituary in the New York Times and other papers across the country. He was a very, very well-known physician. And I don't know how well remembered he is. It's now been 90 years since his death. And it's just interesting because it's a little piece of history right down the road from me. So this is your latest journey down sports history. I am Mike Pilch. We'll talk to you next time.